Hey everyone, my name is John Fink. I work at the Community College Research Center, and I'm going to be talking to you about two different tools that we've developed for unpacking program enrollments and completions with equity in mind. And the first one I'm going to focus on is looking at program enrollments. And this is based on this research brief that Davis and I wrote, and it's up on this website. I think you'll have the link. But if you go to this page, you'll see a short description of the brief, as well as just some of the key guiding questions for this analysis, this investigation. So these are the sort of questions that we keep in mind throughout this whole exercise. What programs are students enrolled to? What do these programs lead to in terms of further opportunity, further education and into the workforce transfer, et cetera? Like, what do they lead to? Which programs lead to more or less opportunity? And then crucially, number three, is student representation across these programs proportionate? Is it equitable? Which programs have groups that are over or underrepresented? So it's what programs to, what do they lead to? And what's the representation? Do we have proportionate representation, particularly thinking about those programs that lead to more opportunity after graduation? So those are sort of the guiding questions, and I'm going to be talking about two different tools. The first one is based in Microsoft Excel, and it's really designed for colleges to take and replace and use their own data, and then that tool sort of visualizes that data to get at these questions. And that's all focused on program enrollments. And the reason we use Excel is because only colleges have their data on which program students are enrolled in. The second tool uses publicly available data from the federal government, Department of Education, or IPEDS, and that's based on completions, or sort of what programs are students graduating from. And that, because that's publicly available, we've already sort of done the analysis and we have that in a Tableau format. And I'll spend the second chunk of this talking about that. But let's dive into program enrollments in the Microsoft Excel tool first. And so when you go down here on this page, you'll see first you can download the brief, which sort of gives more of the motivation, discusses how to use this information, but then you can also see the data tool, and that's the Excel file. So what you can do is click on that and download that Excel file and then open it up. And it should look like this. You sort of start out with this welcome tab. This will sort of go over what I'm going to talk through, and it's just sort of describing the tool, giving the instructions about how to use it, and some ideas for troubleshooting, but I'll sort of walk through all of that now. So you see there's a series of tabs at the bottom here. Really the first one that you need to work with is this data tab. And this is where you kind of have to do a little bit of work here to replace the data that's in the tool, which is just simulated or fictionalized data from an imaginary college. You need to replace this with the data from your students at your college. And to do so, you need to be pretty close to the format that the data is preloaded in. And basically what this is showing is just each row here is one student. And it's giving for each row, like what program they're in, pre-nursing, repair tech, et cetera. And then some additional information about that student and that program. So the first thing we have is like a category of the program. We've been using this categorization around like, what do the programs lead to? Do they lead to more structured transfer, better transfer outcomes? Do they lead to higher paying workforce awards? So that's like a categorization in terms of what these programs lead to. But we think that's a useful categorization to think about, like, are these leading to high wage, high demand jobs? Or are these like a clear transfer pathway or not? But this data is somewhat flexible to other categories that you might have for programs, like things like meta majors or divisions. Like these are health, this is a type of health program, this is a type of business program. So whatever your college uses, to broadly think about programs. Sometimes people put in workforce or transfer. Sometimes people put, divisions, that you might even put campus locations. Just how you usually categorize programs, you can just, either replace the category, or what you can do is just right click here and then insert a new column. And campus was a pretty common one when I'm working with colleges, and they'll put in like North Campus, South Campus, that sort of thing, or other types of information. So as long as you're inserting the column like into the table, everything should sort of adjust accordingly. And then you also have a series of information about students, student demographics, other characteristics. Here's just a couple basic ones: gender, race, and age. Again, if you have additional information you want to insert about students, like say like Pell, yes, no, that sort of thing. As long as you sort of insert, you have to, crucially, I'm like right clicking here and then you insert the column. As long as you do that like within this table, you should be good to add additional fields. So essentially, and then this count, this is just like counting the number of students. I think it's just simplest to have this be a list of students, but if for some reason you have like more of an aggregation of students where, you know, this row represents like 43 Asian males under the age of 18 who are in this program, that will also, you know, just work based on that aggregation. But that's sort of more complicated. So I think it's easiest to just load in a list of students, what program they're in, anything about that program, and any sort of information about that student, all into this table right here. So in terms of working with colleges to access this information, you might be able to pull out a list like this from your student information system, depending on your privileges and access. Otherwise, you know, I think folks working in the institutional research office or other sort of records, student records offices, should be able to just, you know, print out a list of all of the students who were enrolled, like in the most recent semester. So looking at all students, what programs were they, what were their programs of record, and any sort of associated student demographics or characteristics that you want to bring in. So typically we suggest that you look like for a given term, like fall 2021, you know, who are all the students that are enrolled and what programs are they in? And it's helpful to be very broad in making that definition. Like if you have information on non-degree seeking students and anything about like what program they're associated with, or what sort of if you have categories within non-degree seeking, anything you can add in to get the full picture of all students who are connected to your college. Including dual enrollment, concurrent enrollments, really thinking, you know, as broad view as possible, and then just, you know, label students being in dual enrollment, or if they have a specific program, you can put in there. So the idea is to just get a very broad sense of every student who's connected to your college and what, you know, sort of program are they enrolled in. So that's the input data. That's probably the most challenging piece. It's just sort of assembling the right information in the right format. But as long as you sort of match this basic like one row per student format with this column, you know, counting those students up, you should be good to go. So as you can see, like in this fictionalized data, you know, you can go all the way down. It doesn't matter how many rows you have, it'll pick that up. So once you've deleted and then replaced the data with your data in here, there's a couple of things you could do to refresh the rest of the workbook. First, you can just save the updated version with your college's data, close it, and then reopen it, and that should automatically update the whole workbook. Or you can go into the other tabs, which these use pivot tables and charts, pivot charts, in order to sort of draw on this data tab and create tables and charts to visualize what you input from your own college's data. The thing is, like, if you change the data, you need to then update these pivot tables to then reproduce the charts. And so if you save, close, and reopen it, that should update all the pivot tables. If not, you can always go into this pivot table tab here and then look for this like refresh button, and then you can just refresh all. And that refreshes all the pivot tables and all the charts in the workbook. So in the first tab, so we use these like tree map diagrams to just give you like a view of all the programs your students are enrolled in. But in the first tab just gives you a very simple tree map of just what are the biggest programs that your students are enrolled in. So this is very typical simulated data of a lot of colleges. Like most students are in general liberal arts. There's a lot of unknown, undeclared, and sort of smaller and smaller boxes. The other feature that we've added in are these filters for student characteristics. And that just is, this is drawn like from the input data that that's in this tab. So like these columns here. And so what it does is if you just want to look at students who are 25 and older, you click on that and then it'll like refilter and only show those older adult students. So then you can clear that filter to look at all those ages. Same thing with race, ethnicity. And you can even say you're interested in, African-American students who are 25 and older. If you click on both of those, that's who it's showing. So that's sort of how the filters work. You can also filter multiple categories. So if I want to look at Asian, multiracial, and white students, all I'm doing is holding down control while I'm selecting those multiple categories. So a lot of functionality with those filters. This just shows you the overall tree map, but I actually like this nested, the second one, the nested program tree map better. Because if you have information to that you categorize your programs on, like which division or what they lead to, I think it's a little bit more illuminating here. So now we're looking at that same information about like what program students are enrolled in, but it's like nesting those programs within broader categories, like whether these are structured transfer programs or whether they're just general transfer programs, or whether these are workforce programs leading to relatively low wages or workforce programs leading to relatively high wages. And then similarly, you can sort of filter and see like specific groups here to give you that overall. So if I was just like looking at this, I might be interested to see sometimes student age, like under 18, that might just be a signal for your dual enrollment students. So I might click on that to see, okay, well, what programs are dual enrollment students enrolled in? That might give me a view of that. I'll also say if you add in more demographics to that data tab, it's really easy to then go and insert more filters. All you have to do is go up into that pivot table tab, and then they're called slicers, and you just like insert another slicer, and it just adds that in so that you can look at a different characteristics. The other tip I'll give here is so this is looking at one type of program categorization, but say you want to look at like another type, you want to group this by campus or look at it by division or meta major. Again, up here in that pivot table analyze button, you can pull up the field list, which gives you the controls for like what's included in the pivot tables. If this is sort of like going too quick through pivot tables, there's like a lot of really good like YouTube videos, and if you just sort of Google like pivot table basics, that's essentially what I did to create this. Like this isn't, it's pretty easy to learn this pretty quickly just through researching stuff on Google and YouTube. But anyway, so this is like how you build a pivot table. And if I wanted to, instead of grouping programs by that workforce transfer category, and I wanted to group it by like meta major or division, I would just go right down here, workforce transfer, sort of drag that out of the table, and then take this meta major up here, and then I would drag it down right on top of that program. If you put it under the program, then it nests it in a different way. That doesn't really make as much sense. But if you nest the program within the meta major, then you get a different view, but I think is also pretty useful. And you're sort of seeing, say your meta major, arts, humanities, communications, and design, you see all the programs there. Maybe you've got your health meta major division, you see all of your health programs and so on and so forth. It's just a different way to look across your programs. So far we've been getting at like the questions of what program students are enrolled in and what do they lead to, but this question of representation is also really key. And for this one, I'm going to jump right to the fourth tab, representation in programs, because I think this is most intuitive. What this shows you, and here's the pivot tables over here that the charts are drawing on, if you wanted to get the specific numbers, but I'm going to just zoom right into the charts. And what this will do based on the data you put in is it'll just show you your college's top 20 programs, and it'll show you the student composition of each of these programs. And it starts showing the racial ethnic composition. And so what I would be looking at here for this fictional college is just, okay, overall, across all of the programs, this is the racial breakdown of this college. So it's got 54% white students, 7% African-American, et cetera. But then if I look at the top programs, you can sort of just compare, okay, well, this top program has 61% white students. Pre-nursing has 68% white students. So I'm always comparing that back to the college overall. And one sort of insight here is that white students are overrepresented in the pre-nursing program and underrepresented in other programs like the AA business. Again, this is all fictionalized. So this gives you just one sense of like looking across your programs and to see like where are there patterns of under overrepresentation, and to think about like making sense of that in terms of, is this problematic? What sort of college policies or practices might be like resulting in this in terms of exclusionary policies and practices? And then another component here that I think is useful, especially if you've already categorized your programs about like, okay, this program leads to a high wage job, or this is a really strong transfer program, or you have something like this program categorization, you can then filter to look, okay, I only want to look at the the high wage workforce programs. And then it sort of only shows the programs in that category. And you can see just how this sort of compares. So we're seeing like a lot more in this fictionalized data, a lot more white representation in these high wage workforce programs. If you compare that to other programs, you can sort of just look to see, based on what these programs lead to, what is the representation. So I think that's probably the most useful things to do looking at your own program enrollment data, is just getting this tab number 2, this broad sense of like all the programs students are enrolled in, and then filtering that, like if you have specific priority populations, like let's look at our older adults, what programs are they enrolled in, as well as looking in your top 20 programs, how does the representation in these programs compare to the representation of students at the college overall? One additional sort of note here is that if you're interested in looking at something other than race ethnicity, you can again go over to the pivot tables here. If you click on the pivot table, go to the field list, you can take out race and then put in something else, another category like gender. You do have to do that for each of these tables. I think there's maybe just two tables. So I'm going to take out race, put in gender instead. And then when I go back to the charts, now I'm just getting like the gender breakdown for the programs. And you can do that with any other demographic that you add in. Okay, so that concludes the sort of the demo of this Excel tool. And next, I'm going to move on to talking about looking at program completions using our Tableau tool. Okay, so like I said before, this data on program enrollments, this is something that your college has to provide because this is institutional student record data. But program completions is actually publicly available through IPEDS, or the sort of federal government reporting. And each year, colleges, every college across the country reports to IPEDS by program how many students graduated and these different levels of credentials, certificates, associates, and that information is disaggregated by race and gender. So it's a pretty large data set. It covers colleges across the country, and it gives us very detailed information about what programs students are completing. And so based on that publicly available data, so I've created some tableaus to sort of explore and look up your own college's results. And I'll share this link. This is a link to my public Tableau page. I have some different dashboards here, but the two I'm really going to focus on is this: what college credentials are students completing, and then explore college completions by program with associated earnings. This one actually I just released in early January. So and it actually just builds on this earlier one, but adds in earnings data from the college scorecard. So I'll just sort of focus on this one to sort of show you what you can do. So when you click on this Tableau link, we get a welcome tab that introduces the data tool and sort of foregrounds these key questions to consider. What programs are students completing? What do they lead to? And which groups of students are underrepresented in programs that lead to stronger outcomes after graduation? So I'll just sort of show you how I like to look through this. The first tab just shows all of the awards that community colleges across the country granted in the most recent year, 2019-20, based on, associate degrees, long-term certificates, short-term certificates, and then you can just hover over and see like, oh, these are all the CNAs. Here's all the short-term business credentials and childcare provider assistant. So you can just sort of get a sense of the 1.4 million awards that community colleges awarded in 2019. But of course, we're interested in Michigan. So let's go pick on the state and we'll select Michigan community colleges. And here we have 30,000 awards. And you can see the distribution in terms of the type of credential. Looks like it's 68% associate degrees. Most of these are in liberal arts and general studies. And then the next biggest one is registered nursing. So this gives a sense statewide. And then of course, depending on what college you're at, you can select your own college and sort of look at the same view for an individual college. We can look at these by like the level of credential, certificate associates, bachelor's degrees too. So some bachelor's degrees, but we can also group them by their program area. So are they in arts, humanities, sort of general transfer, business, healthcare, and you can sort of just see at your college what degrees are students completing. Okay, so that's just the big picture of what awards are students completing. You'll notice too in this update, what I did is I merged in the college scorecard data on program level earnings. So this is like associated earnings because these are different students who graduated like 4 or 5 years before. And but based on those students, and those students were students who were on financial aid, we have from the college scorecard what their earnings were 2 years after they graduated. And so it's not really surprising, but you can see for students in the RN graduates, these are the RN associate degrees. They were making an average of like $55,000, $56,000 an annual salary 2 years after graduation. And you can also see in the detail that's like across the Michigan community colleges. So that's an average across like 1,900 graduates across 26 institutions for which there's valid data. But it basically gives you a sense of, for these programs, like what are they leading to? What are the associated earnings? It's around 40 grand for the LVNs. And then for like the CNAs, it's like 21, 22 grand. So you can kind of get a sense in other areas too, what are the earnings among graduates. So in the second tab, I make that more explicit by, I'll just group by award level again. So the big blue blocks are associate degrees. But what I'm doing is I'm grouping these programs based on, are they in the bottom, middle, or top third based on the earnings of their graduates. And these terciles, I think they're called, are defined here. And it's just taking these programs, which students completed them, and then what are their associated earnings, and showing like which programs are the relatively higher earning ones, which among graduates, which ones are the relatively middle and lower earning. And then there's, as you can see, there's a lot of programs that just didn't match to the scorecard data. That's for a variety of reasons, but just we have missing data for those. You can see in the bottom earning programs, these are like transfer programs, liberal arts, general studies, associate degrees. And it's important to note that the scorecard earnings are for students who have completed the program. So these students completed the general studies associate degree, and they're working 2 years after graduation, but they're not enrolled at any post-secondary institution. So these students likely did not transfer. They completed the general studies of associates and then didn't transfer and are working and making an average of like $24,000. So I think this really, it's like highlights the stakes of improving transfer, although it's, you know, in terms of evaluating transfer programs, there's better metrics like around transfer rates and bachelor's completion rates among transfer. But nonetheless, you can sort of look at this for your own college and see sort of how your programs are grouped based on these associate earnings. The last thing I'll share is just these last three tabs focus on the representation among these different programs that students are completing. And we're still looking at Michigan, we're still looking at community colleges, and this is looking at associate degrees. And it just sort of kind of like the top programs tab from the Excel file. It shows just what are the top associate degree programs that students have completed. Liberal studies, general studies, RN, business administration. But here, crucially, it's looking at the racial ethnic composition of the completers. And just to sort of illustrate this, we'll sort of select white students. So across all awards that went to all Michigan community college students, white students accounted for like 72% of all Michigan community college degrees or awards that were completed. But you can see like how this varies by program. You know, for some programs, they're like for RN, for nursing, white students accounted for like 78% of the associate degrees of nursing and 72% of awards overall. So that's how you get to this idea of like which groups are overrepresented in these programs. And similarly, you can look at other groups. Here's Black African-American students. They account for 10% of awards overall. And for culinary arts, they account for like almost a quarter of the awards. Similar for computer programming associate degrees. This is just a way to sort of look at representation across these awards. But we're also interested not just in programs overall, but what about the programs with the highest associated earnings? And that's where I have this filter here. And you can filter to just show, okay, let's just show the programs that have the highest associated earnings or that are in the top third for their earnings according to the scorecard. So we have science, technology, dental hygienist, respiratory care. And so now it's especially sort of interesting and important to look at the representation. So again, looking at white students, about 72% of awards overall. We knew that from before. But now when you look across these programs, these associate degrees that lead to the highest earnings, they're pretty much over 72. They're pretty much overrepresented in most of these programs. These are the higher earning ones. And similarly, we can look at other student groups. For Black students, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, but you kind of get the sense of how you can go through and sort of look at Hispanic students, look at Native students, etc. So a couple other tips here is that, you know, I've been focusing on the racial disaggregation, but you can look by gender too, and you can look at the sort of intersection of race and gender, which gives you a lot of categories here. But what's useful is like just click on one and it'll give you the highlights for here's Black women. Black women in Michigan accounted for like 6 or 7% of awards overall, and about 7% of the RN. So you can sort of get very granular, very detailed in terms of looking at race and gender. If you're only interested in a couple of these groups in particular, you can just only select them to focus in. And yeah, I think in terms of just like making sense of this, I think these last tabs are the most useful because it really gets to the program level and you really look at representation. There's also a tab that shows the same thing, but for short-term and long-term certificates. And then for the few but important community college bachelor's degrees, we have those in the bachelor's tab too. So of course, if there's any questions, I encourage you to reach out, but I hope these tools are useful to sort of advance the work at your college.